to the How to Get an Analytics Job podcast. So I've got a longtime friend here. So Justin, when's the last time we actually hung out in person? Was this 15 years ago?
It's probably 15.
Oh.
Somewhere in the plus decade range for sure.
Which is wild. So just to give some context on Justin here. So we both studied from 2008 to 2012, right, at UNCW.
Mm-hmm.
But then you went off and kind of went into the world of therapy. And also, too, you have started your own business, and then currently you're the COO of a company right now, right?
That's correct. Yep. You
So
want to talk a little bit about it?
Yeah. I was about to say, I'm giving the surface level. Just give us your Batman origin story.
Yeah. So yes, it has been some time. It's nice to be connected with you again, man.
Yeah.
So when we were in UNC Wilmington, I studied social work, which is really, I think in general, I didn't really know what I was wanting to study, but I've always been attracted to working with people. I had worked with people in some capacity prior to that. And throughout my social work journey, I've always been really attracted to helping people in a variety of contexts. So that first introduction was helpful in terms of being really value aligned around the things that mattered to me, in supporting disenfranchised people of all kinds, all walks of life. And the evolution of my story post UNC Wilmington was really becoming a little bit more sophisticated in the clinical space. So I grew up in Connecticut, in Newtown, Connecticut, and I came back to Connecticut to get my master's degree. I went to UConn. I studied clinical social work. I have a master's in social work. And then from there, I mean, it's like the career arc, right? So it's kind of a long story, but the abridged version is I found myself really attracted to working with young men. I worked with juvenile probation for a little while, in public and private schools for a bit. And my work in juvenile probation centered around mostly young men, and that kicked off my entire career. So over the last 10 years, I've really dialed in my focus clinically, focused much more on private practice, private enterprise mental health, and have supported young men for plus a decade, again, in a weird way. So now at this point, like you said, I'm a chief operating officer at an agency located in Westport, Connecticut. I'm actually stepping down from that role in 2025 and focusing full time on a private practice that I built 3 years ago called Valiance Counseling and Coaching. And really, that's where my experience is at. That's really where a lot of my attention has been, is in a private practice kind of format, helping people one-on-one. But I've also broadened my personal interests in coaching people as well. So I've had a lot of experience as an athlete, as a high-performing athlete in a variety of contexts. And I've been really blessed with the opportunity to support all sorts of kind of coaching arenas, whether it's in the CrossFit space or in the soccer space, in the executive functioning space, in the consultancy space. And so I've really blended my personal interests, both from a clinical perspective, psychotherapeutically, business. I consider myself an entrepreneur. And then also, of course, on the coaching side as well.
Gotcha. Yeah. So part of why I wanted to have you on the podcast is we were talking about Dave Ramsey before we hit record, and a lot of the people who have money problems, it's not actually a money problem. It's like a mental health or some type of psychological issue. I feel like that same concept ports over to getting a job and sustaining a long-term career. So let's talk about like, how can you, well, I guess first let's start about like, what's the state of mental health? And then we can dive into how does one kind of safeguard their own mental health when they're looking for a job, when they're building skills, when they're interviewing, and then once they like land their job and, you know, seek to get promoted and rise up the ranks.
Yeah, well, a big question to start.
Yeah.
I think it'd probably be helpful to talk just about like, what do we even mean when we're talking about mental health? And I'll give you my definition for whatever it's worth. But what I like to think about, and a lot of the conversations that I have with providers and with clients, is thinking about it analogously to physical health on a spectrum. And so, you know, at any given moment, there are phases of your life. And at sometimes you feel very physically healthy, you're eating well, you're training well, you're sleeping well, your relationships are going well. And then sometimes it doesn't work out that way. And sometimes that's your own doing, like mistakes that you make, or sometimes
Mhm.
things that happen to you. Obviously, COVID was a great example. A lot of people's physical wellness
Right.
down as a consequence of something that none of us could have predicted, literally a once in a century event. And I think similarly, mental health falls on that same spectrum where at any given moment, you could be feeling kind of stable, grounded, mindful, um, kind of less distressed, less preoccupied. And then there are other moments where I think we can all sort of relate to this, myself included, where we're kind of our own worst enemy. We're thinking too much about ourselves. We're kind of self absorbed in a way that's not necessarily narcissistic, but kind of keeps us stuck. We're worried about our presentation with others. We're worried about things that are maybe outside of our control. There are things that have happened to us in our childhood, in our key developmental periods, college being one of them, for example, that kind of stay with us, but that no one knows about. And so you asked about what's the state of mental health. If we think about the state of mental health, I think we have to also consider that's going to be different for every person. And I know that's kind of punting the question, but it really is individualized. Every single person, because of the uniqueness and individuality of their experiences, struggles and overcomes challenges in a myriad of ways that I think are really specific to that person. From the people that I work with, I would say categorically, I have a lot of experience working with young men. And I think young men specifically are struggling more than they have in the past. And there's a confluence of reasons for why that is. But I think now more than ever, there is incredible access to information that creates this storm of not being sure of what the future may hold. And so I think you and I could probably relate to this to the extent that we're now able to do almost anything in 2024, soon to be 2025. The vision for ourselves could be, you could choose multiple paths, whereas, historically that's not been the case. And so in a weird way, you would think, well, isn't that a good thing? But I actually think that creates a lot of distress, specifically for young
Yeah.
professionals, because it's almost like choice overload. Like if I go here, then I'm not going there. And if I go there, then I'm not going to that other place. And so choosing a path becomes really hard. So I would say the state of mental health, specifically with young men, and I guess just more generally, there's more anxiety, there's more depression these days. I don't know the figures off the top of my head, but I know prescription drugs are now more popular
Right.
than ever. Prescription for depression, anxiety, ADHD is higher than ever. And even just aspirational pieces, if you track people going to college, choosing like higher education options, there's been some interesting data there with respect to young men not necessarily seeking that higher level of education. And so like what's the story there? And I think in general, again, very, very broad brush here, but I think people really struggle to know how to build a meaningful life. And that totally makes sense in the context of today's day and age.
Yeah, it's funny because I was talking about one of my students created a like a clips channel on TikTok, and I sent it to you, and you were like, "I don't have TikTok." So one thing that I've heard is that in 50 years, we're going to look back on social media very similar to how we look back on cigarettes. Do you think that's true, or is that like just a kind of a talking point?
Well, I mean, one of the things that I've personally thought about is the people who have invented this stuff have been very outspoken and in their personal lives have chosen not to integrate it with their families, right?
And
And
they
so
don't
like
let their kids on it. Yeah.
that's what I'm saying, right? So like
Yeah.
doesn't that tell you a little bit of a story around
Right.
who whoever invented, I can't remember the tobacco company, the big tobacco company back in the day, but like they knew what they were getting themselves into in terms of pushing an addictive product. And I
Mm-hmm.
think similarly, we're all so connected to our phones. I have my phone literally right here. Like we're so
Yeah.
connected to social. And so it's so tricky because you can't avoid it, right? Whereas tobacco and, sort of that era, it was so permeating every social situation. It was rare the
Right.
cases where you would go to a person's house and an ashtray would be at the center of the table. It was just assumed that as a part of the culture, the cultural norm at the
Mm-hmm.
time, that smoking was a part of the thing that you just did. And I think similarly, getting on social and playing this game for business owners like you and I, it's like, oh man, I really don't want to be on TikTok, but am I
Right.
losing out? Am I actually
Yeah.
behind if I'm not? And I think
Yeah.
the answer is unequivocally yes, I am behind. And so to your point, who knows what it's going to look like 50 years from now, but I think there's no question when we think about raising children, more and more families, I think, are going to be really cautious around
Mm-hmm.
what they do to keep their kids safe from these kinds of access points. Because Jonathan Haidt just wrote a book about this, but we can't necessarily control all the inputs, and that's the
Right.
scary part, right? It's like kind of analogous to having your kid drive a car. Like you can teach them to be super, super safe, but it's all the other drivers that we're worried about. And I think social media is somewhat similar. It's like we can teach people how to use it relatively safely and be boundaried with it and set time guards and time domains, and you can't be on it on certain times, but the amount of inputs is overwhelming. And so I think there's probably some validity to what you're saying is we'll look back on this and really be almost in a way kind of shocked at just how quickly we got caught up in it.
Yeah. Well, it's funny because one thing that I have a love-hate relationship with is LinkedIn, because the people who are getting the most attention are not the people you should be listening to. And I'll give you a case in point of this. So like I joined a mentorship, like career services program with the former VP of Nielsen, like the data aggregation company. And it's interesting because I found he actually connected with me, who I have a bigger following than him, which is like absurd as hell, if you ask me. But put it as like, I just started this podcast when analytics was hot. Like I've been running this consistently for 5 years. But yeah, he reached out. It's funny because I saw his post about like starting the mentorship group, and I went and looked at the messages. It's like, oh, he reached out to me like 2 years ago, and we had like a brief conversation. So it's almost like the people who are posting the most consistently have like some ego void to fill, and they're doing it to kind of self-soothe or make themselves feel better, versus like the people who are actually saying something that is important or is true. They don't get as much engagement as like, I am so sick and tired of like, here are the top 3 tricks to land your first analytics job. And it's just the same iteration of that over and over and over again. But I see 500, 1,000, 3,000 engagements on that. And it's just vapid, not helpful, but I guess it feels good. I don't know. It's a really strange kind of, it's almost like an inversion to what should be. Like it's weird that I'm interviewing people who are in positions of like, authority, and they're kind of like intimidated when I send them a message, but then I go in to work at the fresh market and it's like the VP doesn't see me that way at all. Like I'm in the hierarchy. It's a really strange time.
Well, I think what you're describing, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but have you ever been to like a party and the loudest person, let's say college, for example.
Yeah. Oh,
you're at a party in college and the loudest voice in the room is getting the attention, but that's probably not the most interesting voice. And I think that's sort of just, I think, a human thing where just because you're getting a lot of eyeballs doesn't mean what you're saying is true.
Yeah.
And it doesn't necessarily mean that it's even the most valid. It just maybe happens to raise the most attention, right? And so when we're thinking about, okay, there are people out there who are pumping out some really amazing content. They're not getting noticed because they're not actually after that ego trip. They're not actually after being the loudest voice in the room. I think they're more value aligned. And I'd like to think that you and I are similar in this way, where we're interested in being intentional in what it is that we're sharing for a specific kind of audience. And if it can be meaningful, then great, right? That's the hope. But it's not just saying things to say them. And there's a level of being deliberate there, which takes real mindfulness, truly, because one of the concepts that I'm familiar with, I think you would be as well, is this idea behind audience capture.
Yep.
And as people view your stuff, and you know, as a data analyst, I'm sure you can relate to this. You're like, okay, well, clip A versus clip B. Well, clip A got more views, so that must mean that that's what the audience likes. So what am I incentivized to do? I'm more likely to produce more of that same content. But you have this slow drift over time where now all of a sudden, have you lost some of your authenticity as a result of that? What are you chasing? Are you chasing what it is that your audience wants, or are you chasing what it is that you started to try to do in more of a value aligned way? And I honestly, that's just a universal challenge, right? Because it's very hard to not play that social game. I would be guilty of it as well. Like, of course, I'm going to be caught in that. And it's really key to stay value aligned, I think.
Well, I guess where my mind is going is it seems unhealthy for the people who are following that content. So you're seeking out content that validates your own mindset. Like in this space, all I need to do is just build a portfolio and learn Power BI and I'll get an analytics job. Yep. And it's just not that simple because it's, to your point, it's a case by case basis, but it's almost like they're seeking comfort in someone who is ultimately just taking their attention and monetizing it. It feels almost like cancerous in a way. To me.
Yeah. Well, and it lacks discernment, right? So you can trick yourself into believing that the content that you're seeing is helping you. But true change comes from your ability to actualize what it is that you're learning.
It's also just, it's uncomfortable. It's the opposite of that.
Yeah, for sure. So I think when you're consuming content, it's only as good as what you do with it. And if you're just sitting in your bedroom listening to some people pump out some content related, let's just say some of the stuff you just mentioned, which is not my I don't know a lot of what you're referencing, but if you're like, yeah, that's great. Now I'm one step closer to being a data analyst. It's like, well, is that actually true, or what have you done?
Right. Yeah, it's like I guess you're kind of in the herd. So there's like a group and comfort in numbers type thing, but it's not actually moving the needle in any meaningful way.
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's the equivalent of anything in pop psychology. You pick up a book, you're like, wow, now I understand this. Okay, it's one thing to intellectually understand it and grasp it. It's another thing to apply it. And to your point, what's the harder of the two? I mean, it's great, by the way, not to say anything disparaging to the people who are actually absorbing content, because there's a step prior to that where people just don't even engage. So on a spectrum of people who are engaging versus not engaging, I guess you deserve some credit for engaging with some of this stuff in hopes of learning. And so the learning aspect is key. What do you then do with the learning is, I think, the difference maker.
Right. Which that's much harder to distill down into a punchy post that has 0.1, 0.2, 0.3 and into it.
Way harder.
So yeah, I guess go ahead.
Go ahead. Yeah.
So I guess it's just hard. It's the point I want to get across is I worry about the people who listen to this podcast and social media, specifically LinkedIn, negatively impacting their mental health because maybe they're searching for a job and all of the people they're seeing are like senior analysts or doing like a kick or like, I just landed my dream job. I think it's a recipe for getting discouraged and feeling kind of inferior.
So what have you noticed in terms of mental health within that field? Like what are people sort of feeling, do you think?
Well, okay.
When they get discouraged, do they just bow out or what happens?
Well, so I ran a career services program for 2 years. So I got a direct line to people who were transitioning. So I teach at Greensboro College. So I'm very well kind of versed in helping a student go from college to their first entry level job. It's a little bit more complex when I've worked in insurance sales for 5 years and now I want my first analytics job. So that's like, I get your point of like, it's a case by case thing. But one thing I've noticed is that those people trying to make that job transition, it's very hard on your mental health because, first of all, there's uncertainty that you've got to wrestle with. Then there's the imposter syndrome of I don't know if I can even do this job. But then also too, there's the hard reality of the job postings that you see are wish lists, not the actual, the job for the role that I'm in now. They listed 2 pages of roles and
Mm-mm.
responsibilities, and it's like maybe 5 lines is what I'm actually doing. But if you're new to the space, like you can't discern that. You can't tell like, okay, this is kind of BS. Like the classic example is R and Python or Snowflake and Databricks are 2 systems or tools
Mm-hmm.
that you use one or the other. You don't use both at the same time, but a company
Mm-hmm.
might list both, and
Mm-hmm.
you need to have 5 years experience in both. And then the person seeing that is like, I have this one, but I don't have this other. So I think that the first challenge is getting that first job.
Mm-hmm.
And another thing that is making this even more complex and difficult is that I literally shut down my career services training program because the job market shifted. So in 2021 and 2022, there was a boom in analytics jobs. But then once my placement rate fell below 90%, I shut down the program. Well, part of it's because I had 100% money back guarantee. So like I was losing I was spending all this money, and there was quite a bit of like emotional labor I had to do of like,
Mm-hmm.
I would get angry texts from like the career services students of like, I thought you said we were going to do this, blah, blah, blah. And like in hindsight, it was like they weren't mad at me specifically. I think they were just like screaming into the void of the world.
Yeah, venting.
Yeah. So yeah, there's the market is not in a great place right now for people trying to get their first analytics job. But I mean, this podcast, how to get an analytics job, is pretty vague. It's like, yeah, your first one is an analytics job, but also going from junior to mid level is another analytics job, and senior. So I guess this podcast is more geared towards like a sustainable long term career.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, that first one, it's competitive. So do you have any tips or like advice on how to navigate the job hunt
I love
better?
this. I
Yeah.
love this. I love this. So a huge part of my work is supporting young professionals. I built a whole career on it. And this is a concept that comes up, honestly, no matter what the industry is. Because I think if you remember, what does it feel like to be dangerous enough but not have any sort of practical skill? So you have all the education, right? But you don't even know what the first step is going to look like. And so what I feel comfortable commenting on is more so the mentality, which is, I hear you what you're saying when you can feel discouraged, because gone are the days where you can just pump out applications and get a response. It requires a brand new way of thinking. And I think the importance of reframing really comes up for me in a lot of the work that I do with young people. I also teach at universities here in Connecticut, and this is a concept that I'm often referencing, because when you go to apply, I think you want to start to view your career, much to your point, as an arc. I like to think about things in decades. So when you think about things in decades, you're at the beginning of your journey when you graduate from your master's program. I teach graduate students in social work, and I say, congratulations, you've made it, but you just started. Right.
Right. Yeah.
And so that's it's a weird kind of like, wait a second, I thought I just invested all this money, all this time. I thought I made it. No, you're actually the beginning. You've just now punched your ticket to now be seen as even viable. And so what's the mentality there? The mentality is, there is no escaping paying your dues, but you can't ignore excellence regardless of the industry. So there are certain characterological components that make up a good employee. And I think it spans far beyond the technical skill. I'm assuming probably in your industry, there are prerequisite technical skills that you must have. And so for the vast majority of candidates, they probably all have technical skill. And oftentimes when I'm working with clients, they'll come to me and say, I'm going to spend a lot more time taking these courses and brushing up on skills. I was meeting with a client the other day who's spending time on their own, searching for ways to kind of tinker with their skills. And a lot of my discussion is, that's great, but I think that comes from a feeling of, oh, the thing that I'm missing the reason I'm not a good candidate is because I don't have the technical skill prerequisite. And I just don't think that's actually true. I think a far greater emphasis should be put on what are the things that no one else is doing. And so the difference maker is Cal Newport talks about 3 things that you can have when you don't have any experience. You can either build knowledge, you can build skill, or you can build your network. And I think the harder of the 3 oftentimes for young people is building the network and doing things that demonstrate value at little to no cost. Being able to demonstrate that you have the willingness to put yourself out there, that you do think on 10-year time horizons, and you're saying, for the first 2 years, I'm willing to kind of practically work for free because the experience that I'm going to be getting there is going to bump me to the next level. And once you make your first salary, that sets the floor. So if you make $40,000, it's not like you're going to go less than that, right? You're only going to negotiate for higher than that. And so you might say to yourself, oh man, I did all this work for this like low level job that I think that I'm better than, and that I'm not making the kind of money that I had dreamed of. But if you bet on yourself on a long-term time horizon, the compound interest of your effort across that 10-year time horizon, you're going to outpace people if you just get started in things that you're uncomfortable with. Networking, I think, tends to be an area where people just underestimate. And by the way, I hate the word networking because I think it has this stigma to it, which is like, I got to have like these like sort of weird surface level conversations with people.
Here's my card.
Higher.
Yeah.
What's that?
Here's my card.
Yeah, exactly. And by the way, from a person who is an introvert, I have a strong distaste for inauthentic conversation. I want one-on-one discussion. And so just change the word. It's not networking. It's allowing yourself to learn from people who have done it prior to you with no anticipation of reciprocity. Just go in there and learn. Like, you don't need a job from that person. You don't need anything. One of my mentors and someone who's taught me a ton has told me that every one of those meetings, the ultimate goal of that meeting is to just get another meeting. That's all you need. Yeah. Just get another meeting with another person. And if you start to think about these in chunks, now you remove finances. Like, okay, I need a salary. It's got to be this number. No. Don't aim for that goal. Aim for something that's in your control. Can you meet with someone in the industry that you're interested in talking to and just be genuine?
Yeah. So yeah, I feel like networking it's almost like a lost art. Like, people don't really get it. And I think that probably you and I have an advantage in that we're entrepreneurs, so we have to sell.
Yeah.
Like, so it forces us to go out. Because I mean, when I was first starting the business, like, I would go and give public talks on analytics in Greensboro and Salem, and what I quickly learned is that you don't want to just ask. You don't want to say, give me. What you do is you give first. You just give, and you be thoughtful. Like, I just met a student who's interested in financial analysis. Roger over here, he works in finance. I'd like to connect them. Roger's probably flattered that, I thought of him, and yeah, sure, this student could go take Roger out to lunch. So it's like you're kind of a connector, but you're also doing it in a thoughtful way. Because the thing that you kind of hit on, or I think to consider, is this thing called social capital. So it's like, how much relationship value do you have in the bank? And the way you put that in the bank is by helping others. So like, I
love it.
Yeah. So if you're trying to, you've met someone and they can help you and you immediately ask for it, it's like you're going into the negative. You're going, and it's just not a good long-term sustainable plan.
This is a extraordinarily important and apt analogy. The relational bank account.
Yeah.
And by the way, it goes beyond business. Surprise, shocker. Right?
Yeah.
Like, any relationship, you and I, is the ability to give without any expectation, because it's the right thing to do from the standpoint that if you're interested, genuinely curious about the other person's experience, you can learn from them. And that in and of itself is the value. You spending time with a person and learning from them and just getting to know them in a more authentic way, a more three-dimensional way, learning about their life, their passions. That's enough. And as you do that, you're not actually, one of the things that sometimes people worry about is like, well, they're not going to make time for me. Try to make it not transactional, right? It doesn't have to be a thing where you're asking for anything other than, can you give me 15 minutes? I would love to learn from you. And for the people who don't want to give that, that's okay. You're probably aiming above your pay grade anyway. So then aim lower, right? There's so many people at so many stratifications. If you're aiming for CEO kind of conversations, you might not get that. But there are people below those people who you can reach out to and get to know. And it's not like, oh, tell me, where'd you vacation and stuff. Like, it doesn't have to be surface level. You can go in there with really pointed questions. What are some of the challenges that you faced that you've overcome, and how have you done that? And if there is anything right now that you feel like you need help with, what would be the top 3 things that you're worried about on a day-to-day basis? Okay, that person then gives you information for free that tells you what the market is looking for, at least in that one specific example. And you can choose to either help that person or offer to help that person, or just file it in your bank account in your head. You're like, okay, well, now I know that in general at this level, these kinds of people are struggling with these things. What can I do to brushing up my ability to be able to help if that were to occur in a different conversation?
Yeah. And there's also, I guess, this is not a fully baked out thought, so I'm just going to put this out there. So this is making me think of a story that happened 2 weeks ago. I guess it's 2 weeks ago is when the specific instance happens, but back 2 months ago, it kind of ramped up to this situation happening. So actually, it goes even further back because I got published on LinkedIn Learning. And the thing, I guess the point I'm trying to make is the things you've done in your life that you're good at, you can help other people with. So for example, I ran into the director of learning at the company that I got the job at. And I mentioned, oh yeah, I'm published on LinkedIn. I've got 15 courses. I developed my own learning platform. And she was like, no way. Let's sit down and have a meeting because I think we should totally get analytics training. And then from that, multiple other people came in and I got introduced. And then one of the other directors, who's not even related to, it's a marketing director. It's not even related to analytics, or it's not even related to training, got pulled in, was like, this is a fantastic idea. He came up last week and introduced himself to me. And I was like, hey, let's go grab some food sometime, the following week. Then we went, sat down and had a sandwich together. Turns out we're both into wrestling. We're both into jujitsu. We're both into powerlifting. We're both into diets. And by the end of that, sit down at the Jimmy John's where we're having unwitches with no bread. He was opening up about he just ended a 19-year marriage, which is kind of incredible. He didn't have to offer that information. It was completely unprovoked. But he also wanted to talk about the dating apps because I guess he figured, I'm younger. I've most likely been on the dating apps.
Yeah.
But there's something to that of okay, networking, if you've done things in your life and are successful, that can set you up almost kind of like the setup for making new relationships. Mm-hmm. And it's I've done something, so I can just give you high level advice about it. And then that's kind of a Trojan horse into getting into the conversation that's much more personal. And now it's we have a relationship. And I don't know if that's useful to those of you who are listening to this, but I think that's a really good example, a concrete example of what networking is, of this is a personal thing. This isn't a top 3 list. It's not I feel like we were kind of talking about networking at a high level. I thought it would be a good idea to bring it down to a specific example.
Yeah, I'll give you a concrete example myself. And I think you're making it real, which is important because, by the way, you and I are made a little bit different here, as you mentioned, with respect to just some experience. And so I can envision some of the viewers sort of saying, well, that's great. I'm literally talking to two people or listening to two people who built businesses.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things I most respect about you is that you're a great connector. There's no question, right? So like, talk about a strength. You inherently have that strength. Now you could say, well, I didn't always have that strength, but you're at a place now where it's something that's like kind of old hat. So there's people for sure who are like, well, that's great for you guys, but I don't have the gift of gab. I'm more technical. I'm more concrete. What do I do in those situations? There are people who have that skill who can then just demonstrate that skill with people. So you don't necessarily need to be a great communicator to be in and around people who have a similar skill. A concrete example would be the skill that I have as a therapist is that I know how to work with people. Okay. If what is networking for me, there are psychologists, psychiatrists, and other therapists. That's my universe. I don't need to know what they do. I don't need to know if I need anything from them to know that I speak a similar language to them. And so what I'll practically do, and I'm doing this now as I move into full-time private practice in January, is I'm just going through a Rolodex with me and my admin and saying, give me all the psychiatrists, give me all the psychologists, give me all the social workers who have 5 stars on Google, and let's just cold email them and say, would you be willing to chat on a 30-minute call? I just want to get to know you. Now, the skill or the knowledge that I have, going back to those 3 things, right? Skill, knowledge, and network. I don't necessarily even need to like networking, which I don't. I have the skill and the knowledge, which allows me to then speak the way that they can understand. And now I can just have a conversation. Say, tell me a little bit about your practice. Tell me a little bit about the work that you do. Where did you get educated? And like you said, that then builds to maybe more of an authentic conversation. So when I have these networking conversations now, they're almost always going to be based in some sort of fundamental building block of the knowledge and skill that she and I have, or that they and I have together. And then blossoms into, okay, now I can connect that person with another person. Now I feel more comfortable being able to cold email, go out for coffees, blah, 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 blah. And now I identify as a networker. Whereas before, no way would you ever catch me saying I'm a networker. No way. I was not that kind of person, but I had those skills. And I think you're hitting on something that's really, really important, which is the belief and the actual internal auditing of what it is that you are good at. I inherently believe that everyone is good at something. And so you could be sitting there saying, I only know things. I have no skill. I'm just full of knowledge. Great. There are other people, no question, who are full of knowledge. Where do those people exist? You're getting knowledge from people. Who are those people? Right. And then as you internalize that, you're like, oh, wait, I actually am pretty knowledgeable in this space. And that's how I can move forward.
Gotcha. Yeah. Well, I think another thing too is that you and I are kind of established in our career.
Right.
I'm sure that you get people reaching out to you only when they need something, right? Yeah. So like, I guess I wanted to give a kind of a 360-degree view of like what that is like, like the people that are higher up these organizations, their time is very, very limited, and they're often juggling like multiple balls, so to speak. So for you to come in and demand their time or like, make an ask, it's a lot, it's
so, but we were talking about
almost disrespectful though, too.
What's that?
Making an ask with no pretense or like, no, like, or like Gary, who's a friend of mine who's a C-suite executive, he told me recently, like last time I saw him, he was like, oh, so-and-so reached out. He only reaches out when he needs something. What's he need now? You know, so it's like you get pegged as that person and you don't get kind of brought into the dinner party, so to speak. Like that you're excluded from the opportunity because you just seem like an asshole or you seem kind of dumb because it's like you don't really get the social fabric that's out there.
Well, this is the important point that you're making, and this is why I'm not in love with the word networking, because it feels inherently transactional.
Right.
And that, I think, is the breaking point. That's the problem. We were talking before, and to broaden the conversation just in general to the social fabric, the relational bank account stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Doing things with no anticipation of reciprocity, but just because it's worth it for you.
Yeah.
Right. So just the exercise of reaching out to people is a worthy pursuit. Even if it's a terrible conversation and it absolutely goes nowhere, or you get ghosted, or you email 4 times and never get responded to, who is learning from that experience? You.
Yeah.
So you're realizing, oh wait, like if I shoot my shot 4 times to the CEO and he never gets back to me, maybe I'm aiming too high. Well, who wins there? You do. But
Right.
the frame is often, oh, they don't have time for me. You know, I'm not doing a good enough job. Maybe there's something wrong with me. Maybe I'm not prepared. But you're putting yourself into a position to say, hey, everything is learning. Every single decision I'm making is like a science experiment. I put in a variable, I get something back in return that I can now improve upon. So after, what do you think? You're going to be smarter or less smart after 50 failed attempts? Way smarter.
Yeah.
Way smarter, right? And that idea, I think you're really onto something with this emotional bank account and relational bank account. If you try to go in there and look for withdrawals, like I want a favor, I need something, remove the agenda, right? Remove the agenda entirely. The agenda is for you to learn. That's it, right? And so I don't need anything in return. I don't want anything in return. I just appreciate you carving out some time for me. That's amazing, right? And what I'll tell you, going back to the earlier part of the conversation, the characterological pieces that I think are like the soft skills, soft skills versus hard skills, the pieces that make up your character, the ability to go above and beyond. Those are the kinds of people, at least for me, that I pay attention to. So it's the kind of person who will, like, I'll give you a story of a woman who was in my other agency that I run. She reached out via email on a web form and just was like, hey, I'm a student. I'm looking for an internship. And nobody does that, right? Every single web form is a client. Hey, I'm a client looking for a service. And then this graduate level student reaches out on the web form and says, I'm looking for an internship. And I was like, oh, that piques my interest. That's something that's unusual in my space. So I go on there, I take a look at her resume, and now she's my clinical admin. Now, she just shot her shot. She randomly filled out a web form, what no one else was doing. And I consulted with another woman who is in graduate school who was looking for an internship. And I said, have you ever thought about just going down in person and stopping by and seeing if you could talk to the psychologist who's on staff? Like, no one does that.
Yeah.
Right. And so because no one does that, when you do that, guess who stands out? It's the random woman who's a graduate student who walks into the agency and says, hey, I saw that this person works here. I'd really love to grab coffee with her. Is she available to chat real quick? And she's going to come out and be like, look, I'm between appointments. I can't chat right now. Right. And you're like, fine. Can I get you for 15 minutes next Friday? Excellent. Right. You got her on the hook now. Right. But that's the kind of stuff that I think people underestimate is the time is absolutely limited. You're correct. Right. Time is a huge factor and people are not going to give it for no reason. And the more higher up you are, the more eyeballs you have, the more precise you are and protective you are of your time. And it doesn't mean you have to go above and beyond and be crazy. You think about like the guy who like stand outside your house. I'm not saying do anything like that.
Yeah.
Right. But I'm saying like there's ways to demonstrate that what you lack in experience, you make up for in enthusiasm. Demonstrate your enthusiasm.
The enthusiasm is a big part, especially for entry-level people. Because they're hiring you not necessarily on what you have now, but like what could be one day. So if you have that drive or that enthusiasm or just like you're happy to be there, that's another thing that I'm seeing as far as like the mental health aspect goes. Like my career track is really interesting from a mental health standpoint because the first 2 internships I got in analytics were terrible. Both of my managers were complete assholes and they were like super demeaning. One of them, I've told this story so many times. One of them spoke English as a second language and had a stutter and was an asshole. So like it was like, I mean, it's almost like something out of like a rom-com, like how bad that was. And it's funny because that led me to like going and starting my own business. But I was thinking about this, like kind of I'm gearing up for this conversation. Something along the way, like while I was running my own business, I gained confidence in myself. and I'm not
Mm-hmm.
so reactionary to where I felt like almost like a scared little bunny rabbit when I had those managers, because I was like new and I was kind of unsure of myself and I hadn't racked up any significant wins in my career yet. So like a manager that's bad in those formative years I don't know if I want to say it was traumatizing. That feels a little bit much for me, but like it shaped the trajectory that I'm in. And now in the job that I'm in, I'm in it's a night and day difference in that my passive revenues stream I can live off of. So like I'm almost framing up my job as like a hobby. Like I studied econ at UNCW. The job that I'm in as a category analyst is an applied economics job. So like I'm not in the book talking about like peaches and apples and $1.99, $3.99. I'm seeing this in like millions of peaches going through the door, and we can adjust the price by $1.50. And it's not like, ceteris paribus, everything else held stable. It's like that whole theory is just bullshit because that's not how the economy works. So I'm getting to see these economic theories that were intriguing to me back 15 years ago play out in the real world. And I don't know, part of me I did have the thought of, is that actually true? Or is it like the narrative that I'm telling myself about this job and I'm just making it become true? Am I delusional?
Well, so there's two things I think you're bringing up here, right?
Yeah.
So there's this idea of the framing of everything that I think is just super critical, right? And when you're at the beginning of your journey, you can see yourself as less than. And this is where I think perspective taking is helpful. Perspective and framing is the same. It's like synonymous, right? So when you're at the beginning of your journey, if you see yourself as less than, you're going to put yourself down. And now all of a sudden you're not going to be viewing things with the level of openness that would allow you to identify as a learner. So you had an asshole boss. Okay. That asshole boss and the trajectory of your career on a 10-year time horizon was absolutely necessary because it allowed you to get to where you are now, able to walk away from what you don't want in order to get to what you wanted. When I was studying in my undergraduate, part of my senior year process as a social worker, as a BSW candidate, was to do several short internships. I worked in hospice. I worked in public housing. I worked in public schools. And the reason for that was to try to give students a breadth of experience so you could whittle down. And I came away from all this stuff learning that it's far more important to learn what you don't want to do than it is to know what you want to do. And so when you're in an experience that you absolutely don't like, the perspective is, great, can I withstand this? For how long can I withstand this, right? What's my mental fortitude? What's the stamina that I have? And the longer I think about the career arc that I'm on, I can then see this as a necessary stepping stone to the next thing, which I don't even know what it will be, but I'm gathering information as I go, which will allow me to inform my next move. And so where you are now, you're able to take this broader perspective. And so to comment on your second theme, just with respect to like how you view yourself now with this as being more of like a hobby, it's not necessarily a delusion. It's actually a pretty helpful frame because it allows you to have fun with it, right? When you see your work as this toil, oh my God, I have to go to work and it's like a never ending process. And I can't keep doing this job and be paid, peanuts for the next 5 years. I mean, I think we have to be intellectually honest and acknowledge that finances are a part of this for sure. And so we can't just be like, well, I'll just work for free forever. And knowing that part of what you're gaining there is the ability to have that self-confidence. One of the things that my mom told me that I'll always remember is this is a general statement, but it takes you a year to learn the job and a year to get good at it. Yeah. So on a 2-year time horizon, you're like, okay, I'm in this thing for 2 years regardless because I ain't even going to be good at it until 2 years from now, right? And so you have to withstand like crappy scenarios and working late. For the first couple of years of my career, I was in the office until 8 p.m. 3 or 4 days a week, regularly getting my ass kicked because I didn't know what I was doing. But I needed those experiences so that I could get here and speak to you, speak to your audience, and do the work that I'm doing now and not necessarily feel like I'm not showing up in a way that's inauthentic. Like, you get what you get because I've done this 1,000 times. And it's through those reps that allows me to now have fun with it. Kind of to your point, like, yeah, it's a hobby. It's kind of a hobby because it doesn't feel like work because I've just spent so much time perfecting it and getting better at it.
Yeah. And also too, what makes it feel like a hobby, or actually, because I've thought about this like quite a bit. I almost feel like I'm in like an ivory tower, like the analogy that like used to be, I guess it's still kind of apt for academics, like you have tenure, to where because I get to just sit in the data, like the business runs, and it's not lost on me that like how amazing it is that every day I come back and the business is still there, having lost a business, over the last year and a half. So like, I don't feel this like dread of like, I have to like hold everything together. I just get to have fun. There's really like low responsibility in this role compared to what I have been doing. And yeah, I get to innovate. I get to play around. I get to explore. And it's just low risk. But also to that point about the reality of the finances, my finances are very, very stable. Plus I'm living off like 40% of what I'm taking home right now, which some of that is the job pays pretty well and the passive income stream is good. But also too, like me and my girlfriend lived together in an apartment her uncle bought back in 2017. The rent's $470 a month because we're just paying the mortgage on it. So like, and then we're mostly cooking at home. So like my cost of living at 35 is probably lower than it was when I was 26, 25. So like a lot of it is kind of the work that I've done, which I guess that's the question I have for like therapists is like, what does that even mean? Do the work.
Well, what do you think it means? I mean,
do the work. I mean, it feels vague as hell to me. It's like, because I think I've talked about this on the podcast. I did transitioning from shutting down my business to getting the job. While I was applying for jobs, I did 6 weeks of outpatient dialectical behavior therapy, where I did confront like a lot of really it was like I wasn't sleeping well because I was so stressed. I was so stressed because I was constantly taking so many like huge risks. And I was just working all the time. And I was very reactive to where now I feel like very rooted and grounded. And then something might come, but it's just like, like I can just like brush it off in a way that, when you're stretched thin, any type of like small hindrance might break you, So I guess to get to your question about what is the work, is it just setting up your life so that you're happier or more fulfilled? I don't know what that means. I still kind of struggle with like, what is, because they always say, do the work. And that's like a thing in AA too, right? Do the work. Yeah. Is it just like facing your demons? Is it all of that?
Well, so you're kind of, if you listen to yourself, you're kind of answering your own question because you recognized, or at least it seems like at some point in your life, you recognized that you were being stretched thin enough so that you were able to take action in a way that I think most people struggle to be courageous to do so. And you deserve a lot of credit because that's a really courageous step forward. That inherently, I think, is doing the work for sure to some extent because you recognize you have an internal sense of what's going on for you. You have an awareness that your life is not headed in a direction that's sustainable and something must change. Now, you just so happen to have the wherewithal and the expertise, let's say, or the competency to point yourself in the direction of DBT. And some people may or may not get that step right, but it's the internal recognition that this is not sustainable that I think is the starting point. It all starts with that kind of awareness. Then when you take that step, which is an extraordinarily courageous step, then when you're there, you're doing it with a level of intention. What in your case, it sounds like your intention was to become more balanced, more grounded, less stressed as a result. And then as a consequence, get your sleep in order, get your stress in order, get your diet in order, get your physical fitness in order, get your relationship in order. It all sort of stems down from that initial appraisal of like, things are not going well, right? And so when I think we talk about doing the work, it both means, are you willing to be attuned to oneself enough so that you can make a change if you needed to? And are you intellectually honest with yourself enough to do the appraisal, do the auditing, and then make the changes? I think a lot of people get really comfortable in the shit,
Yeah.
right? It's like the example I give is like, I don't really like doing laundry. So I get really accustomed to having like messy drawers. Just like my drawers
Yeah.
are never, I don't really fold my clothes. I just put them in there. And I just get accustomed to it. My wife comes in there like, how can you live that way? Right. And so
Yeah.
if she was my therapist, she would say, do the work, which is if you want something to change, you actually have to fold your laundry. You have to do it. Now, that's a relatively innocuous example because my laundry is not impacting my functioning. This maybe has a little wrinkle in it, but I think we're good. Right. So
Yeah.
at the end of the day, it's like, is it impacting your functioning to the extent that you want to change it? And are you able to be courageous enough in your auditing of oneself to realize that this is not sustainable and it's worth some attention?
Mm.
You mentioned something that's really, really important that I want to highlight. It's a really brave step for people who are, I think, particularly ambitious, who recognize that burning the candle at both ends isn't actually a strategy for success. And that taking care of your sleep, taking care of your mental wellness, taking care of your relationships, that is the fuel which allows you to be productive in the first place. Right. And so it would be similar to, I work a lot with students, and sometimes I have students come up to me, high school students, college students, taking a lot of AP classes or high level performers in academia, or sometimes not even that. And they'll be like, oh, I have this massive test. I got to stay up late and study. And I think to myself, there's diminishing returns at a certain point, right? Once you get past, let's say, making it up 12 a.m., you're gassed. You don't have the intellectual capacity at that point to even internalize any of your learning anyway. So is it actually smarter to go to bed earlier and then wake up earlier, a little bit more rested because you got some sleep? You put the work aside. You said, anything that I'm going to be doing right now is actually not going to be helping me. It's going to be hurting me. I get the rest that I need, which then allows me to fuel my body with a healthy breakfast, study, and go to work. Right. And it seems counterintuitive. You're like, well, wait a second. The test is literally tomorrow. I need to study. Yeah, but you're not actually learning at that point, right?
You're just
It's diminishing
self-soothing.
returns. Yeah. Well, you feel like you're being productive, but you're not. Right. It's the
Right.
people
Yeah. It's
who,
like you have anxiety about the test. So you're like, oh, if I stay up till 3, then I get 3 extra hours. Yeah. I mean, it's funny because like literally talking to a therapist about this, it's like, damn, that's so obvious. But that being said, like, it's weird when you're in an unsustainable place, but then also you have a lot of people being like, wow, you're amazing, or wow, you're doing so well, or like very proud of you. Which, like, unfortunately, what happened when I went through DBT, I basically lost the majority of my entrepreneurship friends because we're no longer kind of on a similar wavelength. Like I'm worried about them because I'm afraid they're going to have a heart attack at like 45 or 50 because they're just constantly stressed all the time. And it doesn't seem like they're ever just neutral.
well, they're not. Most millionaires are not happy. And by the way, you say something that I think is really important here as well, which is people only see the externalized version of what it is that you're presenting. And so when you're a boss, dominating, making lots of money, making lots of connections, literally employing people, being extraordinarily entrepreneurial, hey dude, I'm working 12 hours a day, like get on my freaking level, Elon Musk shit.
Yeah.
Elon Musk has literally said, you don't want to be me.
His mind is just a storm. Yeah.
A storm. So when you look at the external facade of what a person's presenting, what you're missing is all the stuff that they have to go through to get there. And frankly, I have a lot more admiration for people like yourself who have the wherewithal and the courage to step away and be more balanced and three-dimensional. Because at the end of your life, I think no one's going to give a shit about how many emails you sent and how much money is in your bank account. They're going to care. Did you take care of your relationships that mattered the most? Were you there for your mom? Like literally,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Were you there for your girlfriend? Were you able to have the conversation with the random, worker who delivers your mail? Like, look, these conversations don't matter that much, but when you're 85 and you don't have the capacity to have those conversations because all you've been focusing on is emails, you've now atrophied a significant part of your muscle. The whole point of living is to be able to contribute on a larger level than yourself. And so if people are giving you all these accolades, oh my God, you're amazing, you're amazing, you're amazing, they're not noticing all the stuff that you're sacrificing to get there. And by the way, it's really important to highlight that there is a huge phase of life, I think, namely in your 20s, where sacrifice is the name of the game, period.
Yeah.
But if it's not sustainable, you have to be wise about your life at a higher level. It's not just burning it down and like hustle culture all the way. If it were like that, you're going to be miserable.
Yeah. I call it my chaotic young man energy. It's like, I think it's burnt out at this point. Just like a young savage, just constantly trying to just charge ahead.
Well, how old is your audience, do you think, in general?
It's the majority of them are probably mid-20s. So some of them are in their 30s and 40s and all the way up to some people in their 50s too. So I think we pretty much the whole gambit.
Yeah. So every phase of life requires a different level of energy and a different kind of prioritization. Ray Dalio talks a lot about this. And I think in your 20s is a time for extraordinary experimentation. And some of that savage energy is necessary to do that, right?
Yeah.
In your 30s, you're now balancing a little bit more of the family component. And in your 40s, your career is solid. And so now you're thinking about other ways to develop a meaningful life. So you say, hey, Justin, what does that even mean, a meaningful life? Well, I think the first step in understanding what a meaningful and fulfilling life is to actually do some value inventory around what the hell you're here to do and what do you actually care about. Because you probably are pouring a lot of energy towards things that you thought you cared about, but actually don't matter as much as you think they do.
Yeah. And that's, relating it back to the podcast and the analytics job, it's a conversation I've had recently with people I knew who are working in an analyst job where their boss's mood and their boss's opinion, they're almost codependent upon that. So if the boss is having a bad day, it's a bad day. If it's a good day, it's good. And it's funny because we've been talking about it and it's like, you need to get divorced from your job on some level. Like you don't need to be married to it. Like it doesn't need to be this very, very, like, I don't know, almost like you talked about attachment earlier, like kind of like an anxiously attached relationship.
When you write your obituary, when they write your obituary, they're not going to say anything about you being a great data analyst.
Yeah.
They're not going to. Right?
Yeah,
no one's going to ever say Justin was an amazing social worker. No. Justin always responded to my emails. Justin was an amazing boss. It's not it. They very rarely are not going to comment on that. They're going to comment about the pieces of your life that have a little bit more. It's kind of squishy therapy world, but this is like the intangibles of what makes it worth it. And so I think you're making an important point with respect to the audience and what they're going through. It's really important to be dedicated to work. Let's not lie to ourselves. You have bills to pay. You have shit to do. There's people, mouths to feed. There's people who rely on you 100%. And at times, just have the presence of mind to step back and recognize where it is that you're at in your career journey, where it is that you're at in your personal life. And are you actually doing the things that you want to be doing? Are you leaning the ladders against the right walls? Are you climbing the right steps?
All right, that podcast over. That's it right there. We figured it out. We solved therapy. But we have been going on for over an hour at this point. So, Justin, thank you so much for your time. This has been an amazing conversation.
Yeah, I appreciate it, John David, man. I appreciate all the work that you're doing. I appreciate all the connections you've made, all the work that you're doing. You're an incredibly powerful force for your audience, and it's been a pleasure chatting with you, man.
Awesome. Thanks.